As we do almost every other week, we have only one gospel this week. But today's gospel has two major points. First, there is a point that in the King James Version is translated as Jesus wept. Second, there is the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Now, frequently people will point to the brevity of the phrase Jesus wept as somehow being important. But John wrote in Greek, not English. Anytime we concentrate too deeply on the symbolic meaning of a straightforward text, especially when relying on translation, I think we do the author a disservice. Now, to be clear, our second reading is from the book of Revelation. If you want to try to decipher the symbolic meaning of that work, have at it. And with John, there are certainly times that he used language that implies a spiritual meaning in addition to the literal meaning. But I think in this case, he says that Jesus wept because Jesus, God made man, wept. The whole point of the incarnation of Jesus' human life was to become truly human and experience all that it is to be human, including weeping over the loss of his friend and the pain of those around him. God, through Jesus, chose to become part of not just our humanity in the big ways, but in the little ways as well. And to have that experience to bring into relationship with us. But then we come to the second part, the raising of Lazarus from the tomb. Now, in Judaism, the notion of the immortality of the individual soul is not really a certainty. The concept of resurrection, as we understand it, is therefore not now and was not at the time of Jesus an important aspect or belief in Judaism. Rather, there was this notion of immortality and resurrection as a people, that one lives on through one's descendants. And it is through the end of a lineage that a person truly dies. Up until this moment, at the grave of Lazarus, there had been stories of recently deceased people being raised from the dead. But it was always cases in which the person had died within a few hours, even a few minutes of being revived. Realistically, these stories are like someone being resuscitated after their heart had stopped. They are amazing, but in our own age, they occur through modern medicine fairly frequently. But with Lazarus was truly dead and had been for several days. His soul had left his body. He had no remaining neural activity. His lungs had stopped drawing in oxygen. His body had grown cold. And as Mary said, he had begun to stink. He was dead. For many in the crowd, not only was his body past the point of recovery, so was his soul. He had ceased to exist as an individual. It only lived on in those who knew and loved him. And yet, Jesus brought him back from this true death. Jesus restored him, body and soul. For us as Christians, the focus has typically been on the first part, the body part. Looking to the book of Revelation, we look for a time when in some future day of the Lord, there will be a new physical reality for all of us, including those who have gone before us in faith. And this is very much part of our faith. But for those who had witnessed the restoration of Lazarus, the second part may have been more miraculous. And it is in this second part that we find that we live in faith and not just hope. You see, for Lazarus to be restored, body and soul, his soul had to go on living as a distinct person while his body remained in a tomb. It is in that understanding that our souls continue on after we leave our mortal existence in this plane of reality, that we take faith in the communion of saints. We believe and know that those who have gone before us in faith remain with us and are part of our existence. When we believe that we share with them that same Eucharistic meal that we celebrate every Sunday. They are here. They are present. And when we share that meal, we can feel their presence in a true way. And as we celebrate this Feast of All Saints, and as we mark this peaceful transition of the role of presiding bishop from Michael Curry to Sean Rowe, I think it is fitting that we talk a little about the first bishop of the Episcopal Church. Now, some of you have heard me talk a little about Samuel Seabury before. He is marked on the calendar of the Episcopal Church with a feast day on November 14th. And back in 2009, when I, still very much identified as being Roman Catholic, wrote a term paper on him, on Francis Dasbury, and on John Carroll, because all three men became the first bishops of their respective denominations in the United States during the same era and in reaction to the same event, the formation of the United States as an independent nation. Now, when we think of the saints, we tend to think of people like St. Francis, people who gave up everything for the sake of the gospel, people who lived spotless lives, at least after their conversion experience, and people who make the notion of sainthood seem impossible for the rest of us. Samuel Seabury was not that. He was imperfect, he was flawed, and he annoyed a lot of people. Samuel Seabury was a loyalist. In the days after the end of the Revolutionary War, he claimed authorship for a series of letters published in opposition to Alexander Hamilton and the notion of independence. He continued to lead loyalist Anglican services throughout the Revolutionary War. Members of his family fled to Canada after the war because they were loyalists. But he chose to stay, assuming that his role as a clergyman afforded him some protection from reactionary mobs. If the Episcopal Church wanted to choose a clergy member to represent their independence from the Anglican Church and allegiance to the new nation, Samuel Seabury was not that person. Samuel Seabury also owned other people. He was a slave owner. He was a Northern, based in the cities of New York and Connecticut, and so it was not the slavery of the Southern plantation system, but he held people in bondage throughout his life. And Samuel Seabury's own writings demonstrated a moral understanding that the very institution of slavery was wrong, whether it was the cruelty of the plantations or the bondage of tradesmen and housekeepers that was more common in the North. Forcing people to work without wages and separating husbands and wives, mothers and children through slavery was cruel and inhumane. And Samuel Seabury knew it. And yet, he participated in this institution throughout his life. And finally, Samuel Seabury was stubborn, ornery, and not particularly well liked amongst many of his peers. He became the first bishop of the Episcopal Church because he was stubborn and went to England with the blessing of his Connecticut peers, but not the American priesthood as a whole. Priests in other states, particularly those who had risked their lives in the Revolution, did not really like Samuel Seabury much. And in England, Seabury was rebuffed by both the official bishops of the Anglican Church and those who drew their lineage from those who had followed a more Catholic tradition, as a result of the Wars of Succession within England over the previous century and a half. Ultimately, this meant that Seabury was not really ordained by the Church of England proper bishops, but rather three bishops who held to a more Catholic tradition in Presbyterian Scotland. Now, for a bishop to be ordained, three bishops are required to be part of the ceremony. So even with his ordination, Seabury, in and of himself, did not create a true episcopacy in the United States. For that, three other bishops, William White, Samuel Provoost, and James Madison, and no, not that James Madison, a different one, were ultimately ordained by the Bishop of Canterbury and by two other Church of England bishops in England. It was one of those bishops, William White, who became the first presiding bishop. But Samuel Seabury, this slave-holding, stubborn, loyalist bishop, became the second presiding bishop of the United States. And his leadership in creating the Episcopal Church as a denomination for the people of the United States has allowed us to gather here today. He was not perfect. He was not particularly nice to be around. He was not a good patriot, and he was a sinner. But Samuel Seabury is nonetheless considered a saint, and one we celebrate during this feast of All Saints. And in this, I find great hope for all of us. If Samuel Seabury could become a saint, so can any of us. And so can any of our loved ones who have gone before us with all of their flaws. God does not call us to be saints only once we have achieved perfection, but in our imperfect humanity, a humanity that God chose to be part of. We are called to be human and to see the humanity in one another and love one another in our imperfection while striving for perfection. We are called to love one another, flaws and all. Amen.